Okay. All right. So this is a figure, right, that I had taken from Hermann, page 13. So it is a figure that looks at the mediating role of decision processes between the change agents and the degree of policy change. And so in his figure, you'll notice that he didn't put in adjustment changes. Yeah, but because he, remember that the way Hermann actually defined major foreign policy change is that it only encompasses program change, goal problem change, and international orientation change. Yeah. In fact, um, in his work, right, if you were to read his article, he seems to conflate, or he actually um, parks adjustment change under program change. Okay. Okay. So primary change agents, like we said just now, could be leaders, could be bureaucratic um, policy entrepreneurs. It could be domestic restructuring. It could be external shocks. Yeah, so basically, these agents must effect foreign policy change through the decision-making process. Yeah, so the decision-making process is like again, we are talking about the black box of foreign policy decision-making, right? So the decision-making process is what would either facilitate and advance the change, or it could obstruct the change. So remember that change it's not a unilinear deterministic process, right? Change is not unilinear, it's not deterministic. It can move forward, it can move backwards, it could remain the same. Yeah. So if you were to read Alden and Aaron, right, they actually categorize Herman's adjustment change, um, and actually not tactical change, sorry, program change as tactical change. Yeah? And they looked at goal problem change and international orientation change as strategic change. Okay. Any questions so far? All good? Okay, good. Okay, we are at 1:15. Do you want to take a break? Because after this, I've actually got some videos, which is actually case studies. I wanted you all to watch the video and to discuss the video. Yeah. So trying to look at the video using what I've gone through just now, the theory, right, the concepts, the framework, yeah, and trying to analyze it in terms of Hermann's program change, goal problem change, international orientation change, etc. Yeah. So, and then of course, identify the primary change agents if possible. And so basically, trying to get you to pull out evidence from the video, right, to substantiate what you're saying, what you're, the concepts that you're drawing in from the theories, right? Okay, so maybe we can take a break here and then come back, say, around 1:40, 1:45. The extent of foreign policy change from the previous Trump administration, for example. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions on the next page, right, of the PowerPoint slide. So you might want to look at those questions as you're watching the video. Yeah.
U.S. President Joe Biden has outlined his vision for U.S. foreign policy. In his first major policy speech, Biden sought to reassert U.S. global leadership, rebuild alliances, and reverse Donald Trump's America First agenda. He announced an end to support for the war in Yemen and a halt to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Germany.
The United States is ready to engage with the world again. That was Joe Biden's message from the marbled halls of Washington's State Department. For Biden, this means foreign policy must be grounded in a multilateral world rather than a defense of America's interests that puts America first.
America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy.
So the US will once more try to find solutions to the world's problems. Like in Yemen, dubbed the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Years of conflict have destroyed much of the country, killing hundreds of thousands of people and leaving more near starvation. The US has given tacit backing to one side of that war. No more, says Biden.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
Biden also said his administration's diplomacy will involve a clearer defense of democracy. He called on Myanmar's generals to surrender power. And he signalled a tougher tone on Russia than the last administration, urging the release of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny and pledging he'll keep Vladimir Putin's Kremlin in check.
Days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, interfering with our elections, cyber attacks, poisoning its citizens, are over.
For Biden, strengthening the US's stance on Russia and China will mean reaching out to Washington's old allies in Europe and elsewhere. He ordered a freeze on US troop withdrawals abroad, including from the US's bases in Germany. The Trump administration wanted to pull out nearly 10,000 troops. Biden will depart from that plan.
America and alliances are our greatest asset. And leading with diplomacy means standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies and key partners once again.
This administration comes to power with diplomats' morale low and its alliances chafing. Restoring both will be a huge challenge.
DW's Peter Röhle-Dahl is monitoring this story for us. Peter, what sort of vision did Biden lay out for America's place in the world?
Well, what we saw there was really Biden, trying to turn the page on 4 years of isolationism and really restore diplomacy as the U.S. main tool of choice. It was a speech that in some ways reminded me of former President Teddy Roosevelt's famous phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. Biden very clearly promising to counter-advancing authoritarianism, singling out Russia and China, saying, really putting them on notice with regards to human rights abuses, singling out China's unfair trade practices. So a very clear signal there that the times are changing, or really we're returning to or turning our backs on the policies that we saw during the Trump administrations, the courting of more authoritarian regimes. Also, talking about restoring America's moral leadership there, saying, that he wanted a strong support for LGBT rights, but also restoring America's refugee program, admitting a lot more refugees into the United States. And I think from a European perspective, really sending a clear signal to allies that the U.S. is standing shoulder to shoulder with its allies, that it will pursue a multilateral approach. And I think that's going to be music to a lot of people's ears here.
Well, talking about transatlantic allies, Biden mentioned Germany several times in his speech, a real departure in tone from his predecessor.
Yeah, I mean, Biden there singling out Germany as one of the U.S.'s top allies, and that was very notable. He also announced a freeze on the withdrawal of more than 10,000 troops from the U.S., a very controversial move by the Trump administration that had ruffled a lot of feathers here in the U.S., and also maybe signaling that Biden will continue to look to his transatlantic allies to also keep Russia at bay. It's also a signal of Russia, I think, to tell him that the U.S. is not going anywhere. But it's not a complete sigh of relief for Germany, maybe just yet. Biden also signaling that he will continue some of the pressure campaign that we saw during Trump to get its allies to spend more on their military, to spend more on NATO. So the U.S. So Germany not completely off the hook, and really also signaling to its allies that they need to pull their weight on the global stage, but that the U.S. is right there with them. So a very important speech, I think, from both the U.S. but also a global perspective here.
Peter, thank you very much. As always, DW's Peter Röller-Dahl.
Okay, so let's take a look at these questions. So what extent of foreign policy change do you think Biden is signaling? With his announcement that America's back, diplomacy is back, that's the center of our foreign policy. International orientation change. Yeah, okay. Interesting. Okay, so Yong-Seng, you say international orientation change. What would you provide as evidence that there's international orientation change? So remember what you said right just now? Okay. So you're saying that they are becoming more active on the global stage again. Yep. We reaching out to the EU allies. Yes. And he's also signaling that. Remember, they're pulling out of the Yemen war, right? Or trying to end the war, right? Because remember that international orientation change is actually talking about how his, the whole state. I mean, the U.S. as a whole, right? Its foreign policy has shifted, right? With regard to several states or on several fronts with one state, for example. Yeah. So that's basically the entire orientation towards world affairs have changed. So from isolationism, it's becoming a globalist again. Yeah. And it's basically no longer, it's basically rebuilding its ties with its allies. It is signaling, right, uh, its more aggressive stance towards Russia and to China. Yeah. Okay. So, what, and then of course, when he says diplomacy is back, right, that also indicates that the methodology, the program is a program change, right? They are no longer going to be um, using. I guess not say no longer using sanctions. They are still using sanctions, but they are going to be starting off with diplomacy first, right? Okay, so what would be the primary change agents that you see here? So you remember that this particular slide, yeah, we talk about the primary change agents, and at least Hermann actually sets it out as the primary change agents as leader-driven, bureaucratic advocacy, domestic restructuring, external shock. What do you think is a primary change agent here? Oh, by the way, these colored ones I have actually inserted these colored words in here, just so that you can, sort of like pull in um, all the different concepts into this picture, into this figure. Okay, so if you look at this slide, the primary change agent would probably be leader driven, right? Yeah. Okay, so basically, I mean, it's a different administration, different top person. The bureaucrats, all the cabinet members have changed, right? So all these are basically primary change agents. Right? Now, of course, you would assume that with the change in the bureaucrats, change in the cabinet, right, there will be different policy preferences as well, right, within the new individuals that are taking over the bureaucracy. Yeah. Okay, so again, the last question. To what extent is foreign policy change the same across all areas? For example, climate change, Russia, or China? And if it's not the, I mean, here what I'm talking about, the extent of policy changes here. Extent of foreign policy change. Is it a program change? Is it a goal problem change? Is it an international orientation change? Yeah, so international orientation change, Yong Seng already mentioned. But can you also see goal problem change? Can you also see program change, right? And in which areas, right? The extent? Is the extent the same? Do you see maybe uh, you know um, one particular change, right? Maybe in climate change, it's only program change. Maybe in terms of Russia and China, it is international orientation change. Uh, with program change, I don't know. Right. So you want to analyze this because foreign policy is not a monolith. Yeah, there are different degrees to which you know changes are made. Yeah, and the um, different aspects of policy will change. Yeah. Okay, are you guys thinking, or are you still, or you all have given up? Okay, looks like Yongxing is the only one in class. What happened to the rest of you? Oh, gee. Uh, Now, I was asking about the last question. To what extent is foreign policy change the same across all areas? So basically, in terms of climate change, is it, in Russia and China, do you see change in all three areas like program change, uh, goal or problem change, and international orientation change? Or is it just, for climate change, it's not really an international orientation change, but it's just program change, right? And then Russia probably, it could, China probably an international orientation change. In addition, maybe a goal problem change. I don't know, or problem program change. Yeah. So basically, what I'm trying to get you all to think of is to think of it in different levels. So it's not like you're just using a very a very just a one-dimensional look at foreign policy. Yeah. Okay, so climate change is mainly a goals change, global shift towards more sustainable practices. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Um, it's. I mean, the orientation change probably has already taken place, right? The international orientation change, or I mean, it's not really an international. I wouldn't see it as an international orientation change either. But there will be probably program change. There will be also goal um, goal change. Yeah, in terms of this climate change. Do you think the orientation or the policy change towards Russia and China? Um, do you think that it is to the same extent for both? Because in terms of Russia, he was talking about it um, in terms of cybersecurity, about interference in its elections, about its human rights, right? Um, or political oppression, right? Um, in terms of China, it's everything almost across the board. Economics, right? Trade war. It's also about human rights. Yeah. And what else? I mean, recently, of course, it's about in the Pacific. It's about security issues, right? So China seems a little bit more broad-based. I would see it more as an international orientation change. Right? Russia could be a goal change, could be a program change. I'm not sure whether you can consider it as an international orientation change. What do you think? Okay, I guess I only have I only have Yong Sing in class. Ah, gee, sorry, Yong Sing, you're the only one, eh? Program change, Yipeng, for program change for Russia. Okay, okay, program change for Russia because you're looking. I mean, I guess you're also thinking of Ukraine now. Huh? The negotiations over Ukraine. Yes, the goals seem to be still the same because they're still stuck in the Cold War mentality. I think, and still that competition between um, the two states, underlying competition, yeah, between the two states. China, the goals have sort of shifted, I would think, and also because China is now considered a rising, emerging power, right? Uh, Existential threat, more or less. So I think it is more of a international orientation change. It's on different fronts. If you look at it, right, they are going after China on BRI. They're going after China on its Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, right? They are also going after China now with the trade agreements, trade war, etc. Yeah, but they are looking at collaboration or cooperation with China on climate change. Yeah. Okay. So it's I mean, you will see that there are different, differing attitudes based on the particular issue that's at, um, being discussed. Yeah. So that's why you could actually have several things going on. I mean, in fact, for international orientation change, I would actually assume that it all collectively, or maybe with international orientation change, right, it does actually trickle down, right, to program change, to goal change. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, they are using different tools. I guess you could say that, right? It's not a single tool. They're using different and calibrating the different tools. Okay, let's look at UAE. I thought this was interesting also. This I think was about maybe about 2 months ago. It's TRT World, looking at UAE and how it's sort of changing, the foreign policy with the I think now the Crown Prince is in charge. It's not MBS, but I mean MBS is Saudi Arabia. This is MBZ, I think. MBZ.
Is the United Arab Emirates making changes to its foreign policy? The UAE's leaders recently released a roadmap that charts the country's domestic and foreign policy for the next 50 years.
The UAE leadership announced a slew of grand projects on Sunday, 3 months ahead of the UAE's 50th National Day celebrations. As part of the projects of the 50 new projects will be based on 10 principles, with solidifying the union being a prime focus.
Some of the points include an emphasis on good relations with its neighbours, regional stability, and the call for peace. It also includes principles like building the best and most dynamic economy in the world and calling for harmony, negotiations, and dialogue to resolve all disputes. The new plan was outlined by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, also known as MBZ. He's been the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi since 2004 and was appointed Deputy Supreme Commander of the UAE Armed Forces in 2005. Given his military background, he has been the leader of transforming the country's military capabilities in what the UAE says is an effort to provide security in the region. And he's also spearheading building stronger ties with regional powers. Evidence of these changes came when the UAE followed Saudi Arabia's lead in ending the blockade on Qatar.
This agreement is not about Iran or about anyone else. It's about bringing our countries together and making sure that we work together to deliver prosperity and security for our people. And we are confident that we are in a place that will deliver that and that the leaderships of all the countries will be working very hard to make sure that we are coordinating our regional policies.
The UAE is also seeking a better relationship with Turkey, with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed expected to visit the country for the first time in 10 years.
For several years, Turkey and the UAE were not even on speaking terms after a series of regional disputes brought relations to an all-time low. But now, things seem to be moving, albeit slowly, in a more positive direction.
According to some analysts, 2021 has been a year the UAE has shifted its main agenda to de-escalating regional tensions and prioritizing the expansion of trade partnerships. The UAE has also become the first Arab nation to send a mission to Mars. It's part of an ambitious space program that aims to build the first city there by 2117. After gaining independence in 1971, the UAE, a federation of 7 Emiratis or states, kept a low profile during much of the Cold War. Its turning point came when it joined the US coalition to oust the Iraqi army from Kuwait in 1991. Since then, the UAE has been closely allied to the US, but now it seems things could be changing.
US President Joe Biden is reportedly removing military assets from the Gulf.
This is a message to the region that the United States is rethinking its military posture and that the region is no longer the United States' priority.
The Biden administration has been accused of slowing down a weapons deal made during Donald Trump's presidency, which included advanced F-35 aircraft and armed drones worth $23 billion. The Biden administration reaffirmed its commitment to the deal. Myra Resnick, a deputy U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, told the Associated Press that the sale of the F-35 fighter jets will go ahead. But that initial pause by Biden was sure to have raised eyebrows in the UAE. And there's also the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which went down poorly in all Gulf capitals. The US and the UAE have been vital allies for decades in both fighting terrorism and containing Iran. But because of Biden's indifference to the Middle East and his focus on Asia, many countries, especially the UAE, could be looking for alternative partners in addressing regional challenges. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed's new foreign policy vision could contribute to the UAE's growing influence.
Okay, I hope that was interesting to you guys. What do you think accounts for UAE's foreign policy change? What do you think was a triggering or change agent? Again, you go back to Hermann, right? The primary change agents are leader-driven, bureaucratic advocacy, domestic restructuring, or external shock. External shocks, yeah. By external shocks, you are actually referring to yes, you're correct. External shocks. So what are you referring to when you're talking about external shocks? What was most obvious that they talked about? Would be the shift, right, in Biden's policy, right? Moving his attention from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, isn't it? Yeah, the withdrawal in Afghanistan as well. Yeah. So that's one. I mean, that's one of the reasons why external shocks, and then of course the fact that the U.S. seems to be changing its policy towards Middle East, trying to cut down on arming, right, the Middle East and arms sales to the Middle East. So that's also a sort of an external shock that they need to deal with, right? They are basically having to scan their horizon, the environment, the external horizon and external environment, and noted this change, right, in the dynamics. Yeah? And then the other thing that you probably would notice is that, remember, the video actually started off with announcing that this is their foreign policy direction for the next 50 years. Yeah, so it's actually, you would consider it as leader driven, probably, right? Leader driven change in the foreign policy. Yeah, they're talking about basically becoming, looking for peaceable solutions, cooperation, dialogue, right? And then also right? You see that they are actually building relations amongst the Gulf, right? Gulf states. They are normalizing their relations with Qatar as well after the Qatar blockade, right? And then probably because it's leader driven, right? You see that they are doing program change. They're doing there's probably a goal shift as well. They also would probably have maybe possibly we wouldn't know, right? Domestic restructuring, right? There may be domestic constituencies that have become a little bit more open to to establishing ties with um, you know and promoting cooperative solutions, right? Maybe possibly bureaucratic advocacy as well. Yeah. Okay, so then you will note that, I mean, when you think about all these, right, these different areas, right, you would be able to use learning approach to discuss the leader driven change. You can use cybernetics to discuss, right, the external shocks, because it's all about managing and interpreting, right, the information that you get from your horizon scanning of the external environment, right? That's cybernetics. And then the domestic political system, probably, there may be changes within, right, the domestic politics that has actually uh, uh, initiated, motivated this foreign policy change as well. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I have this. This was actually from the recent Beijing Olympic 2020 opening ceremony, and you know that Russia and China are actually strengthening their relations. Yeah? So this is just a video to talk about, right, what this means. I mean, this is actually also a shift, right, in foreign policy between the two countries, as well as it also has an impact on the external environment for a lot of countries, right? I mean, in particular the U.S. as well.
The presidents of Russia and China, as we reported, met today and reaffirmed their desire to have closer ties. The meeting comes as Russian troops continue to mass on the border with Ukraine, and after weeks of intense negotiation between Russia and the U.S. and NATO. Amna Nawaz has the story.
That's right, Judy. In a joint statement, both countries said they, quote, oppose further enlargement of NATO and called on the alliance to abandon its, quote, Cold War approaches. The statement also said that China is, quote, sympathetic to and supports the proposals put forward by Russia to create long-term, legally binding security guarantees in Europe. So, what does all this mean? For that, we turn to Elizabeth Wishnick. She's a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis. That's a Navy-funded think tank. She's on leave from Montclair State University and has written extensively about Russian-Chinese relations. Elizabeth Wishnick, welcome to the NewsHour. Thanks for joining us. So that joint statement earlier had some thinly veiled swipes at the U.S. and its allies. Just step back for a moment here and tell us what is this? What are we seeing here? What's driving the strengthening of Russian-Chinese relations right now?
Well, I think the strengthening of the relationship has occurred over the last several years, even prior to the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. So I think we saw this trend after the financial crisis in 2008, when Russia and China saw that there were real problems in the international order, at least in the economic order, and they hoped together to create some alternatives. And so they began to expand their partnership at that time. But certainly there has been a deepening of the partnership over the past 8 years or so.
But what does all this mean in real world terms, especially at this moment? For example, if Russia were to invade Ukraine, do we know what China would do?
Well, let's look at what China did the last time. So in 2014, China was in a tight spot because China has longstanding positions supporting territorial integrity and against the splitting of territories and so forth. And so when a resolution came up in the UN Security Council in March of 2014, China abstained and instead of supporting Russia on that resolution. So I think China will try to thread the needle carefully this time as well, should that situation arise. And I think a war in Ukraine is not in China's interest. They have economic ties to Ukraine and other connections to Ukraine with the Belt and Road Initiative, their trade and transit initiative that wants to connect China to Europe. And Ukraine is one of the hubs that it hopes to use for that. So I think Xi Jinping is hoping that there is a peaceful outcome to this crisis.
At a time of rising tension between the U.S. and Russia and NATO, what does China get from this? What does President Xi get from showing that there's a strengthened bond between his country and Russia right now?
Well, apart from Russia, China doesn't really have a lot of friends in the international arena. So Russia is really the main partner that China has. And so it shows that China is not isolated internationally. In the UN Security Council, Russia has provided some key weapon systems to China that improve China's position in the Indo-Pacific region. And both of them, they use one another to reinforce their understanding of the global norms that they would like to see. So norms that allow more space for authoritarian states and the ability to define some of the rules of the road that they think would benefit them.
So, Elizabeth, there are those that look at this moment and say that it's actually very dangerous in a lot of ways. They see two autocracies who are ideologically aligned, who are attempting to create a dual crisis for the U.S. that the U.S. can't really fight on two fronts against two large powers like that. One analyst actually said it's the greatest threat the U.S. has seen since the beginning of the Cold War. Do you see it that way?
I certainly see this as a precarious moment with more than 100,000 Russian troops poised on the border with Ukraine. But I don't know that we're going to automatically see a two-front crisis here. I think that the comment you alluded to refers to the prospect of some Chinese action against Taiwan occurring while the world is distracted by the Russian threat to Ukraine. And I don't see that as happening because China has long-standing interests in what it calls the reunification of Taiwan, which it considers a renegade province. And this is such an important interest for China. I don't see it tying it to Putin's more opaque plans for Ukraine. China and Russia don't always walk in lockstep on all of the issues that concern them, even though they have the same interest in changing some of the rules of the international system that they feel work against them.
That is Elizabeth Wishnick from the Center for Naval Analysis joining us tonight. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, so you see in Hermann that he actually outlines 7 stages of decision making, right? So basically he says that if in order for change to occur, right, you will need to actually look at your initial policy expectations. If the initial policy expectations are clear enough and there are certain standards that you can use to evaluate whether policy is a success or failure, then the possibility of what do you call it, the policy being changed, right, or the goal being changed may go through. Yeah, and then of course when you look at external actor or environmental stimuli, right, you see that developments in the external environment can trigger how you assess the validity of a existing policy. So if external environment has changed, right, of course your assessment looking at your existing policy, which was put in place, times, uh, several time periods ago, right, may no longer be relevant, right, because of the changes that have occurred. You know. Then, of course, you want to look at, discrepant information, whether, the authoritative policymakers must actually conclude that whatever the prior formulation of the problem or the mode of dealing with it or both is no longer relevant, right, given the new information from the environment, and so they will probably want to initiate a policy change, right? Then, of course, before they do that, right, you want to identify and see, right, whether you can identify the causal relationship between the problem and an existing policy, right? If you know, that is actually the crucial step in actually pushing for a policy change. Yeah. So basically, stage four, right, is basically the crucial step um, in basically is the tipping point, right, for policy change. And then you will want to look at, what are the possible alternatives that you can bring in, right, to reduce the problem, right? So if policymakers are unable to find alternatives to reduce the problem, then policy change is unlikely. But they will often seek out, borrow from, or modify an already existing option, right, that has been applied to a present problem, rather than design. But then if they can't find uh, uh, a viable alternative that is presently being used, they may have to design or invent a new option, right, if no plausible options are found. And then they will also need to build authoritative consensus for the choice. Yeah, so um, they will need to basically get consensus on what sort of how they should be changing the policy, what should be the, the policy direction. Right? So this must be established before the policy change can proceed. And then finally, the stage seven is when they implement the new policy. That's the stage where it can be hijacked or it can be altered, right? And and it can where you can actually alter the intended policy quite dramatically. And so what I've done is I've color coded it to show you which of these theoretical approaches would apply at these different stages. Okay, so the leader-driven change, remember, is associated with learning approach, right? That would be the approach that you want to use to analyze stage one, stage three, stage four, right? Bureaucratic decision making, right? Looking for bureaucratic advocate, right? That would be the approach that you use to analyze stage five, six, and seven. And then when it comes to looking at external shocks and whether the external actor and external environment is the stimulus, right, for triggering a change, right, that would be using the cybernetics approach. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Hope this is clear enough. If not, then we shall go on to transitional states. Okay, so transitional states. How do we define transitional states? Basically, the authors basically look at transitional states as states that are transitioning from one political regime to another. So this usually happens when it's triggered by the dissolving of one regime, usually an authoritarian regime, and replacing it with another regime, which is usually democratic. So these are the typology of states based on the different types, different theorists that have theorized on it. Yeah. So Huntington talks about transformation, replacement, transplacement, which is actually, if you look at how Linz discusses, right, the different types of, also the different typologies of states, it's actually you can basically map it to Linz incumbent caretaker government, right? Transformation is basically Lin's incumbent caretaker government. Replacement state for Huntington would be Linz's revolutionary provisional government, and then transplacement state for Huntington would be Linz's powers sharing interim government. Okay, so one of the things why are we interested in foreign policy of transitional states is because it does provide us with some insights on agency structure problem, right, in foreign policy, also on the dynamics between the state and non-state actors, right, in defining and shaping foreign policy, and also in the socially constructed nature of sovereignty and the international system. Because remember that you have a transitional state. The state needs to reaffirm and redefine itself, right? So what does it stand for? So it's national identity, it's sovereignty. What sort of state does it want to be, and how is it going to be projecting that to the international arena? So the central question when we're looking at transitional states, right, and their foreign policy during that period of transition is when do these transitional governments actually pursue certain foreign policies over others, and why? So basically, when you look at Huntington and Linz, right, then both of them actually suggest that each of these transitional governments actually face dilemma regarding what to do with the former government's foreign policy. Because remember that even though the previous government has fallen or the previous regime has fallen, right, the foreign policy is still ongoing. Yeah. So the question now for these transitional governments, it would be how and when, right, do they demonstrate that they have changed from the previous government or previous regime? How and when do they ensure continuity, and how and when do they retain or build legitimacy? Yeah, because remember that as transitional states, they are moving from one regime to a different regime. They need to reassert itself. They need to show that they are different from the previous government or previous regime, right? But yet they also need continuity. They also need to build their legitimacy. Yeah. So these questions actually depend on which constituency, which domestic constituency the government, the interim government or the transitional government is beholden to, and or should address when they are defining and making policy. Because these domestic constituents that lend them support, right, will actually have uh, an influence and impact, right? Major influence or impact on how they define and make policy. And so basically, as a transitional government, right, you need to basically assert yourself in the international arena, but at the same time, um, you also need to satisfy and build your legitimacy and your support with your domestic constituencies. So such a government needs to balance that relationship with the international community and their domestic constituents. Okay, so if you look at Stanger, basically what she says is that regimes basically do change. Their foreign policy is actually quite variable. Yeah. Um, yeah. So basically, she said that there's no. I know Alison Stanger basically says that there's no specific policy that all transitional states will pursue, right? Some you see them turning inwards, right, becoming more isolationist. Others may actually immediately seek international engagement to define themselves on the world stage. So here I say think about Singapore when it first became independent in 1965, right? When it broke, no, not say it broke away, but it was thrown out of the Malaysian Federation, right? The Federation of Malaya. What did we do? First thing was S. Rajaratnam went to the United Nations, right, to establish that Singapore is now an independent state. Yeah. So this is actually trying to raise your international profile, claim your sovereignty, define yourself, right? Define who you are on the world stage. Okay. So the puzzle for Stanger, right, why she's actually interested in looking at foreign policy of transitional states is she wants to look at why do some new regimes pursue activist foreign policies while they are trying to forge new political orders, while others actually embrace a tactical isolationism. Also, she also wants to look at why do some post-authoritarian governments actually break with the external orientation of the previous regime, while others choose the path of continuity. Right. So transitional states doesn't mean that. Some actually do a complete break from the past, right? They don't want to be associated with the previous regime. Others actually continue with the same policy that the previous regime had, so that there is continuity. Yeah. So she's interested in finding out why this difference, and then how do these choices actually impede or promote democratization? Because when you look at transitional states, right, some of them do successfully democratize. Some of them actually backslide and go back, right, into authoritarianism or some other form of authoritarianism. And so, how do these choices of their foreign policy actually um, impact the transition to democracy? Yeah? And how does the goal of democratization actually circumscribe, right, or limit the realm of state choice? The in international affiliation. So basically, how does it limit who are the states that they affiliate with on the international arena? So basically, if you look at democratization, for those of you who do D&D, this should be quite familiar. Yeah. But but basically, the basically there are three stages of democratization, right? For those of you who do D&D, you would probably know this. The first stage is the end of the authoritarian regime. Second stage is where you install a democratic regime, which is actually the interim government that presides over this, what they say is a temporary stage, right? And the interim government, the legitimacy of that interim government is actually conditional, right? Because it's based on whether they are able to deliver their promise of a new political order. And usually the delivering of that promise of a new political order is the calling of, democratic elections. Yeah. And then the final stage is the consolidation of democratic regime. And usually I think the D&D or the democratization theorists, right, all say that there must be at least two changes, right? Two changes or two stable changes of national elections or government or whatever. Yeah. Okay, two cycles of elections, right? That's called after the um, after the transition. Yeah. So that would be the consolidation of the democratic regime. Okay, so basically, if you look at the interim governments and what choices they have, right, they're actually faced with two critical choices with regard to their foreign policy. Whether they want to decide whether to uphold the current, the international security agreements that was actually put in place by the previous government, which is usually an authoritarian government, and they also need to evaluate, right, what are the international economic relationships with other states. So they need to make the decision as to what extent they want to distinguish itself from the old regime, right, in the internet in their international relations. So, in other words, if you look at, Stanger basically says that interim states actually play the game of transition politics at two levels: the domestic and the international. Because at the international level, right, they need and the domestic level as well, they need to present itself, as a credible, credibly as a break from the past, that they are no longer, the same. They are not the same as the regime before. And then in terms of the policies that it pursues, right, they need to um, please the international audience, right? But at the same time, by doing so, whatever the foreign policy that they pursue, which pleases the international audience, would also impact what it pitches to the domestic audience and vice versa. And that can either advance or impede democratization. Okay, so these are some findings that Stanger basically outlined in her article. So, you look at revolutionary provisional regime, it's usually a revolutionary regime that had ousted or completely replaced the previous regime. So the likely foreign policy of such a regime type, the revolutionary provisional regime, would be a clean break from the past. So if you want to think about a clean break from the past, you can think about it in terms of pre-Weimar Republic in Germany and the post-Shah Iran. And then in terms of power sharing, interim government, right, you will see that power sharing interim government actually is a balance of both old and new elites. You still have the remnants of the old, and you have the new that's trying to basically push forward with democratization. So you find that in such a type of regime, right, the foreign policy is actually contingent. It's really dependent on the circumstances, right? It could actually move towards more, it could actually move it towards more democratization, or it could actually impede democratization. So you might think of post-communist Poland, for example, after after 1990s. Yeah. And in terms of interim caretaker government, right? Interim caretaker government is actually a transformation which is led from above, right? And it emphasizes a continuity with the past regime. So example that Stanger gave was Argentina post Falkland Islands and Spain after Franco. So if you want to learn more about these examples or want to read more about it, you can go back to Stanger. I decided not to summarize it because she already gives you a summarized case study, and she actually discusses it quite well in her article. Yeah. So I just summarized everything into this table. Yeah. So some findings that you see, that she basically pointed out, right, in her article was that you find that elites actually use foreign policy as a tool to try to further consolidate, right, and reconstitute their political authority, especially because they're coming out of, they're emerging from a past authoritarian regime's demise. So those people, those elites who are democratizers, they will want to seek affirmation that their democratizing efforts, right, are working. They want affirmation from the international arena because that gives them external legitimacy that they can then bring back to the domestic audience. Yeah. And you also find that she found that basically the character of the transition actually plays a defining role on the transitional states foreign policy agenda. So you know it is basically one of the it has the most impact, right? It's a critical factor in formulating the post-revolutionary uh, states foreign policy preferences. And so you'll find that the post-revolutionary state will likely break abruptly and radically from the external policies of the former regime. But power-sharing governments are more cautious. They tend to try to, because they are they are sharing power, right? So they try to um, embrace both elements of continuity and while trying to also show that they are changing. Yeah. Whereas caretaker interim governments, because they are caretakers only, right? They are only there for that particular time period. They are likely to defer any major foreign policy decisions until after the elections that are called. And this is especially so if you find that the military is an independent dominant actor in the way that um, that you saw that Stanger actually discussed in the case study of Argentina. Okay, then she also noted that the external actions of the democratizing state or the transitional state can either advance or impede democratization. So, for example, if they were to renounce, if the transitional state was to have renounced the previous regime's external policies, and that leads to improved relations with other democracies, then there's a greater likelihood that that transitional state would consolidate its democracy. And some of the reasons why this is so is because, right, they are able to show that their external policy or their foreign policy is very different from the previous regime. That is a symbolic signal, a symbolic break with the past, according to Barrington Moore, and it is better than basically showing that, and it takes place with minimum violence. And then, of course, you also find that because of their improved relations with other democracies, right, which probably transfer incentives and benefits in terms of foreign aid, military assets, etc., right, it creates additional incentives for the interim government to stay the course and become democratic, yeah, because it also now the enhanced international cooperation actually basically motivates them to do so. But if the renunciation, right, of the previous foreign policies, right, of the previous regime actually leads to worsening or severing of relations with the West, especially the liberal democracies like the US, right, these interim governments are likely to lose control in the transition, and they would likely turn anti-democratic because there might be, and there would be, the democratic goals will be threatened by anti-democratic domestic sentiment. So democratization basically would inevitably lead to a reconceptualization of the state interest, because now the state interest, right, is changed. It's a new regime. It has different ideology, it has different values. So you need to understand, right? I mean, foreign policy students need to understand that foreign policy is actually a product of the elite struggle, right? It actually reflects, right, the struggles that the elites are having, right, in trying to remake the past regime's identity and trying to establish a new identity for the new regime, right, both in the eyes of the world as well as the domestic audiences. Okay. All right. I think I'm going to stop here because the next one is actually Ratner. Yeah. And actually, Ratner comes very well with Eli Ratner. Actually, comes very well with Alison Stanger. Talking about the impact of U.S. support, right, on foreign policy of the transitional states, because it talks about whether or not the U.S. was had previously supported the regime that is no longer in power, or whether it was never a supporter of the previous regime, and that does have an impact on the foreign policy, and also on whether or not they align with the U.S. They align their foreign policy of the new regime with the U.S. or not. Yeah. So let's go through this next week, okay? But just to let you know, yeah, just to show you where these references are from, okay? You'll see that basically this is taken from uh, Alden's subject guide. Oh, yeah. Okay, I need to fix the references. So it's actually from the subject guide, the IR 2137 subject guide, right? The chapter on foreign policy of states in transition. And then we also, I also took some from the Alden and Aaron book, yeah, on basically the chapter on foreign policy and change. And then there's also Charles Hermann that I summarized for you, right? And then Alison Stanger, and then Eli Ratner. All right, if you can read Eli Ratner before next week, that'll be good. It's actually pretty easy to read. Okay, and anyway, you do have the slides from the draft, right, to guide you in your reading. Okay, any questions so far? I hope this was clear enough for you guys. Okay, good. Yeah. If you can go and read these authors, because they are actually, I think, pretty spot on the learning outcomes that you'll need for this block. Yeah. So next week we'll continue with Eli Ratner, and then I think I have a couple more that I need to summarize for you guys as well for next week. Yeah, and then hopefully we are done, and then we can start looking at exam questions the week after. Yeah, because I think the week after is your final, I think week 21, right? Okay. All right, guys. Thanks for coming, and have a good rest of the day. Yeah, and stay safe, stay healthy. All right, and don't forget to read up. Yeah, try to start reading up um on the assigned readings. Alrighty, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right, take care, everybody, and I'll see you guys next week. Have a good weekend. Yeah.